What happens when the very system designed to protect and serve becomes the hunter, and the hunted turns out to be the one who holds the keys to justice itself? A quiet Tuesday morning in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. The sun barely peeking through autumn clouds as Dr. Maya Richardson adjusts her rearview mirror, preparing to drive to what would become the most pivotal meeting of her career. She has no idea that in less than 20 minutes, her life, and the lives of countless others, will be forever changed by a single traffic stop that will expose the ugly truth about racial profiling in America. Dr. Richardson isn't just any woman driving to work. She's the recently appointed Deputy Director of the Drug Enforcement Administration, one of the highest-ranking African-American women in federal law enforcement. But on this particular morning, none of that matters. What matters is the color of her skin and the assumptions that will be made because of it. This is more than just a story about one woman's encounter with prejudice. It's a mirror reflecting a harsh reality that millions of Black Americans face every day, the phenomenon known as driving while Black. According to documented research, African American drivers are stopped at rates 2.5 times higher than white drivers, despite violating traffic laws at similar rates. What makes Dr. Richardson's story extraordinary isn't just what happened to her, it's how she transformed a moment of injustice into a catalyst for systemic change. This is a story about the power of resilience, the importance of speaking truth to power, and how sometimes justice arrives wearing the most unexpected face. Dr. Maya Richardson's journey to the upper echelons of federal law enforcement began in the small town of Monroe, Louisiana, where she was born in 1975 to James Richardson, a high school principal, and Dr. Angela Richardson, one of the few Black pediatricians in the parish. Growing up in the Deep South during the 1980s and 90s, Maya was no stranger to the lingering effects of institutional racism. Her father often told her stories of his own encounters with prejudice, how he'd been pulled over countless times while driving through certain neighborhoods, how store clerks would follow him with suspicious eyes, how he'd learned to keep his hands visible and his voice calm whenever approached by law enforcement. "Baby girl," he would say, "excellence is our only armor, but sometimes even that isn't enough." These lessons shaped Maya's worldview early. She watched her parents navigate a world that seemed determined to limit their potential, yet somehow they thrived. Her mother had broken barriers as one of the first Black women to establish a private pediatric practice in Monroe, while her father had become the youngest principal in the district's history. Their success, however, came at a cost: constant vigilance, perfect behavior, and the exhausting burden of representing their entire race in predominantly white spaces. The late 1990s and early 2000s, when Maya was coming of age, marked a particularly challenging period for Black Americans and law enforcement relations. The war on drugs had created what civil rights advocates called a pipeline to prison for communities of color. Despite comprising only 13% of the U.S. population, African Americans represented over 40% of drug arrests, even though drug usage rates were similar across racial lines. Maya witnessed this disparity firsthand during her undergraduate years at Spelman College, where she studied criminal justice and psychology. She saw brilliant classmates whose brothers and cousins were caught in the system, not because they were more criminal than their white peers, but because they lived in over-policed communities where every infraction was scrutinized, every mistake magnified. It was during a summer internship with the Atlanta Police Department that Maya first encountered the concept of driving while Black in an official capacity. She was reviewing traffic stop data when she noticed a troubling pattern. Black drivers in certain precincts were being stopped at rates that defied statistical probability. When she brought this to her supervisor's attention, she was told, "Sometimes the data tells stories we're not ready to hear." That moment crystallized her life's mission. Rather than being discouraged, Maya became determined to change the system from within. She pursued a master's degree in criminology at Georgia State University, where she wrote her thesis on racial bias in traffic enforcement. Her research, which analyzed over 50,000 traffic stops across 5 Georgia counties, revealed that black drivers were 73% more likely to be searched during routine traffic stops, despite being 32% less likely to be found with contraband. After graduation, Maya's academic excellence and research credentials earned her a position with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. For 12 years, she worked tirelessly on cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations. She investigated corrupt officers, advocated for policy reforms, and built bridges between law enforcement and communities of color. Her breakthrough came when she led a joint task force investigation that exposed a network of officers in 3 states who were systematically targeting minority drivers. Similar to documented cases like that of Deputy Zachary Wester in Florida, these officers were planting evidence during routine traffic stops, resulting in hundreds of false arrests and destroyed lives. The success of that investigation caught the attention of DEA leadership. When the agency was seeking to rebuild trust with communities of color following several high-profile scandals, Maya's combination of tactical expertise, academic credentials, and community credibility made her an ideal candidate for leadership. In January 2019, at age 44, Dr. Maya Richardson was sworn in as Deputy Director of the DEA, making her the highest-ranking African-American woman in the agency's history. She had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, the opportunity to create meaningful change from a position of real power. She had no idea that her most important test would come not in a boardroom or congressional hearing, but on a quiet suburban street at the hands of the very system she had dedicated her life to reforming. October 15, 2019, started like any other Tuesday for Dr. Maya Richardson. She had spent the early morning reviewing briefing materials for a critical meeting with congressional leaders about drug enforcement reform. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was preparing to discuss the very issues of racial bias and police misconduct that had defined her career, but she couldn't have predicted how personal that discussion was about to become. Maya's route to the federal building took her through Brookhaven, an affluent Atlanta suburb where tree-lined streets and manicured lawns created an illusion of post-racial harmony. She was driving her personal vehicle, a modest Honda Accord she'd owned for 3 years, rather than her official government car, which was in the shop for routine maintenance. At 9:47 a.m., as she approached the intersection of Peachtree Road and Dresden Drive, Maya noticed the flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart rate quickened, not because she was guilty of any wrongdoing, but because her father's voice echoed in her mind. Hands visible, voice calm, no sudden movements. She pulled into the parking lot of a small shopping center, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. In her rearview mirror, she watched as Officer Derek Hoffman of the Brookhaven Police Department approached her vehicle. A 12-year veteran of the force, Hoffman had a reputation among his colleagues for being particularly aggressive in drug enforcement, what they called proactive policing. License and registration, Hoffman demanded without preamble, his hand resting on his service weapon despite Maya's complete compliance. "Good morning, officer," Maya replied calmly, slowly reaching for her purse. "May I ask why I was stopped?" "You were speeding," Hoffman replied curtly, though his dashboard camera would later show that Maya was driving exactly at the speed limit. "And you made an illegal lane change." Maya knew both allegations were false, but she also knew that challenging a police officer's narrative during a traffic stop was dangerous territory for anyone, especially a black woman. She handed over her license and registration, noting how Hoffman's expression changed when he saw her name and address, an upscale neighborhood that didn't fit his preconceptions. "Step out of the vehicle," Hoffman ordered after running her information, which came back clean with no warrants or violations. "Officer, is that necessary? I've provided all the documentation you requested." "Step out of the vehicle now," Hoffman repeated, his voice rising. "Don't make me ask again." Maya complied, her mind racing through de-escalation techniques she'd learned in her law enforcement training. She watched as Hoffman's partner, Officer Jennifer Blake, arrived as backup. Standard. procedure that had become increasingly militarized in recent years. "I'm going to search your vehicle," Hoffman announced, not bothering to ask for consent, which was legally required absent probable cause. "Officer, I don't consent to a search," Maya said firmly but respectfully. "I'm exercising my Fourth Amendment rights." Hoffman's face darkened. In his 12 years on the force, he had conducted hundreds of traffic stops in this manner, targeting drivers who didn't belong in affluent neighborhoods. The vast majority complied out of fear or ignorance of their rights. Maya's composed assertion of constitutional protections clearly caught him off guard. "I smell marijuana," Hoffman declared, a common pretext used to establish probable cause. "That gives me the right to search." Maya's heart sank. She knew this game well from her years investigating police misconduct. The phantom smell of marijuana had been used in countless cases to justify questionable searches, particularly against Black and Hispanic drivers. Studies show that police report smelling marijuana in cases involving Black drivers at rates far exceeding statistical probability. As Hoffman began his search, Maya noticed something that made her blood run cold. While rummaging through her glove compartment, the officer's body positioning blocked his hands from his partner's view and the dashboard camera. His movements were deliberate, practiced, the behavior of someone who had done this before. Well, Hoffman said loudly. "Look what we have here." He held up a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be methamphetamine, evidence that had certainly not been in Maya's vehicle moments before. Officer Blake moved closer, but her angle and Hoffman's positioning meant she couldn't have seen exactly where the bag had come from. "That's not mine," Maya said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You planted that evidence. Are you accusing me of a crime?" Hoffman snapped, his hand moving back to his weapon. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance." In that moment, Maya faced a choice that countless Black Americans confront: remain silent and hope the system eventually vindicated her, or assert her identity and risk escalating the situation. She thought of the hundreds of victims she'd encountered in her career, people whose lives had been destroyed by corrupt officers who knew they could act with impunity against marginalized communities. "Officer Hoffman," Maya said calmly, "I need you to contact your supervisor immediately." "You're not in a position to make demands," Hoffman replied, pulling out his handcuffs. "I am Dr. Maya Richardson, Deputy Director of the Drug Enforcement Administration," Maya stated clearly, ensuring her words would be captured by the dash cam audio. "I am a federal law enforcement officer, and I am witnessing you commit the federal crime of evidence tampering." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Hoffman's face went pale, and he began looking around nervously, as if suddenly realizing that this routine traffic stop had become something much more complicated. Officer Blake stepped forward, her expression shifting from casual backup to serious concern. "Ma'am, could you please repeat that?" Blake asked, her training kicking in as she began to sense the gravity of the situation. Maya slowly reached into her jacket pocket and produced her federal credentials, a gold badge and identification card that left no doubt about her position. "I am the Deputy Director of the DEA. I was on my way to a congressional briefing about police misconduct and racial profiling when your partner pulled me over for alleged violations I did not commit and then planted evidence in my vehicle." The whole parking lot fell silent except for the sound of traffic passing on Peachtree Road. Hoffman stood frozen, the planted evidence still in his hand, while Blake radioed for a supervisor. In that moment, the tables had turned completely. The hunter had become the hunted, and the system that had protected countless officers who abused their power was about to face a reckoning. Maya remained calm, but inside, she felt the weight of every victim she'd encountered in her career, every person who had been in this exact situation, but lacked the credentials or position to fight back. She knew that what happened next would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of countless others who would never have the power to demand justice. The real battle was just beginning. the immediate aftermath of Maya's revelation, created a bureaucratic earthquake that rippled through multiple law enforcement agencies. Within minutes of Officer Blake's radio call, the parking lot became a convergence point for supervisors, internal affairs investigators, and federal agents, all trying to understand how a routine traffic stop had exposed what appeared to be a pattern of evidence planting. But Maya's struggles were far from over. In fact, they were just beginning. Despite her position and credentials, Maya quickly discovered that challenging police misconduct, even with irrefutable evidence, was like entering a labyrinth designed to protect the very system she was fighting against. Officer Hoffman was immediately placed on administrative leave, but the Brookhaven Police Department's initial response was to close ranks and minimize the incident. "It was a misunderstanding," Chief Robert Matthews told local media. "Officer, Hoffman is a decorated veteran with an exemplary record. We believe this incident has been blown out of proportion." What the chief didn't mention was that Hoffman's exemplary record included 47 traffic stops in the past year involving black drivers in affluent neighborhoods, a rate that was statistically impossible to explain through random traffic enforcement. Maya's own investigation revealed that Hoffman had been targeting successful black professionals who were driving while black in areas where they supposedly didn't belong. The psychological toll on Maya was immense. As someone who had dedicated her career to law enforcement, finding herself on the receiving end of police corruption created a cognitive dissonance that kept her awake at night. She began experiencing symptoms she recognized from victims she'd interviewed: hypervigilance while driving, anxiety during any police encounter, and a profound sense of betrayal by the institution she'd served. The hardest part, Maya later reflected in congressional testimony, wasn't just what happened to me. It was knowing that if I hadn't had a federal badge and 20 years of law enforcement experience, I would have been just another statistic, another black woman arrested on planted evidence with no recourse for justice. The resistance Maya faced went beyond the Brookhaven Police Department. Even within federal law enforcement circles, there were whispers that she was making too big a deal of what some called an isolated incident. Several colleagues suggested that she handle the matter quietly through internal channels rather than pursuing public accountability. This pressure intensified when Maya announced her intention to file formal complaints with the FBI's Civil Rights Division and the Justice Department's Office of Inspector General. She knew that her actions would make her a target within law enforcement circles, where the blue wall of silence traditionally protected officers from accountability. The personal attacks began almost immediately. Anonymous sources leaked to conservative media outlets that Maya had a grudge against police and was using her position to advance an anti-law enforcement agenda. Social media campaigns questioned her qualifications and suggested that she was playing the race card to cover up unspecified wrongdoing. Maya's family became collateral damage in the struggle. Her elderly parents in Louisiana received threatening phone calls from unknown numbers. Her teenage nephew, an honor student at Monroe High School, was subjected to increased scrutiny from school security after photos of Maya began circulating online. The message was clear: challenging police misconduct would have consequences that extended far beyond the individual making the complaint. But Maya refused to be silenced. Drawing on lessons learned from civil rights leaders who had faced similar retaliation, she began building a coalition of support that transcended traditional boundaries. She reached out to community organizations, civil rights attorneys, and reform-minded law enforcement officials who had been quietly fighting the same battles for years. One of her most powerful allies emerged from an unexpected source: Officer Jennifer Blake, Hoffman's partner, who had witnessed the evidence planting firsthand. Despite facing enormous pressure from her department to remain silent, Blake made the courageous decision to cooperate with federal investigators. "I became a police officer to protect and serve my community," Blake testified in a sworn deposition. "What I witnessed that day was not policing. It was criminal behavior that undermines everything we're supposed to stand for." Blake's testimony was crucial because it provided corroboration from within law enforcement itself. As a white officer with 8 years of experience and no history of complaints against fellow officers, her willingness to speak truth to power carried significant weight with investigators and prosecutors. Maya also found support from an unexpected coalition of victims who had been targeted by Hoffman and officers like him. Working with civil rights attorneys, she helped establish a task force to review Hoffman's previous arrests and identify patterns of misconduct. The investigation revealed at least 23 cases over 3 years where evidence appeared to have been planted or manipulated. Among these victims was Marcus Johnson, a 34-year-old software engineer who had been arrested by Hoffman 6 months earlier under nearly identical circumstances. Johnson had been driving through Brookhaven after visiting a client when he was stopped for alleged speeding and subsequently arrested on drug possession charges that he maintained were fabricated. "I tried to fight the charges," Johnson explained, "but my public defender said it was my word against a police officer's. I was facing 5 years in prison, so I took a plea deal for probation. When Dr. Richardson's case became public, I finally understood what had really happened to me." Johnson's case, along with dozens of others, illustrated the systemic nature of the problem Maya had uncovered. It wasn't just one rogue officer, it was a pattern of behavior that had been enabled by a culture of impunity and a legal system that automatically deferred to police testimony. The emotional weight of representing so many victims while fighting her own battle took its toll on Maya. She began working with a therapist who specialized in trauma experienced by law enforcement officers, a decision that itself sparked controversy among colleagues who viewed seeking mental health support as a sign of weakness. Resilience isn't about pretending that injustice doesn't hurt, Maya told a gathering of young law enforcement officers. It's about finding the strength to keep fighting for what's right, even when the system tries to break you down. As the investigation expanded and media attention intensified, Maya realized that her personal struggle had become something much larger, a test case for whether the American criminal justice system could hold itself accountable when confronted with clear evidence of racial bias and corruption. The turning point came on a cold February morning in 2020, when Maya found herself sitting in a federal courtroom in Atlanta, watching as Officer Derek Hoffman was formally indicted on 47 federal charges, including civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. But the path to this moment had been anything but smooth. For months, the case had been mired in legal maneuvering as Hoffman's attorneys, supported by the police union, fought to suppress the dashboard camera evidence and challenge Maya's credibility. They argued that the video was inconclusive and that Maya's accusations were motivated by an anti-police bias rather than actual evidence of wrongdoing. The breakthrough came when FBI investigators discovered that Hoffman's misconduct was part of a broader pattern involving multiple officers. Digital forensic analysis of Hoffman's personal communications revealed a group chat with 6 other officers where they discussed targeting uppity black drivers in affluent neighborhoods and shared tactics for manufacturing probable cause. 1. Message sent just 2 days before Maya's traffic stop read, "Got another one today, BMW with temp tags. You know the drill." The accompanying photo showed a small baggie of white powder, identical to what Hoffman had found in Maya's vehicle. The revelation that Maya's experience was part of a coordinated conspiracy sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. Here was documented proof of what civil rights advocates had been claiming for decades, that racial profiling wasn't just the result of implicit bias, but sometimes involved deliberate criminal conduct by officers who knew they could act with impunity. Maya's moment of vindication came when she took the witness stand during the federal trial. Dressed in her official DEA uniform, she spoke with the calm authority that had carried her through decades of law enforcement work. Her testimony was clinical, detailed, and devastating. "Officer Hoffman approached my vehicle with his hand on his weapon before even speaking to me," Maya testified. His body language and positioning during the search were consistent with someone who was concealing his actions from observation. When he found the evidence, his reaction was not that of an officer surprised to discover contraband, but of someone executing a practiced routine. Under cross-examination, Hoffman's defense attorney tried to paint Maya as a disgruntled federal employee, seeking to make an example of local police. The strategy backfired spectacularly when Maya calmly recited her 2 decades of law enforcement achievements, her academic credentials, and her history of working collaboratively with local police departments. "Counselor," Maya replied to one particularly aggressive question, "I have spent my entire career fighting drug dealers and building cases based on solid evidence. I know the difference between legitimate police work and criminal conduct. What happened to me was criminal conduct." The courtroom erupted when the prosecution played audio recordings from Hoffman's police cruiser that captured him bragging to another officer about teaching uppity blacks their place, just hours after Maya's arrest. The recordings, obtained through a federal wiretap investigation, provided irrefutable evidence of racial animus behind Hoffman's actions. But Maya's most powerful moment came during her victim impact statement, when she spoke not just for herself, but for the dozens of other victims who had been identified during the investigation. "Your Honor," Maya said, her voice carrying the weight of generations of struggle, "I stand before you today not just as a victim, but as someone who has seen both sides of our criminal justice system. I have witnessed its power to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But I have also seen how that same system can be corrupted by prejudice and abuse of power." She paused, looking directly at Hoffman, who sat slumped at the defense table. "Officer Hoffman didn't just plant evidence in my car that day. He planted seeds of doubt about the integrity of every honest police officer. He stole more than drugs. He stole trust. He stole justice, and he stole the faith that our communities need to have in law enforcement." Maya's voice strengthened as she continued. "But what he couldn't steal was the truth. What he couldn't steal was accountability. And what he couldn't steal was our determination to ensure that no other person, regardless of their race, their position, or their place in society, would have to endure what I and the other victims endured." When Judge Patricia Williams announced Hoffman's sentence 12 years in federal prison, the courtroom fell silent. It was one of the longest sentences ever imposed on a police officer for evidence planting, and it sent a clear message that federal courts would not tolerate corruption that violated citizens' constitutional rights. As Maya left the courthouse that day, surrounded by supporters and media, she felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the victory felt hollow knowing how many other victims might never see accountability for similar crimes. The real test, she knew, would be whether this moment of accountability would lead to lasting systemic change or simply become another footnote in the long history of American racial injustice. The conviction of Officer Derek Hoffman marked the beginning of a new chapter in Maya Richardson's life and career, but the ripple effects of her case extended far beyond a single corrupt police officer. Within 6 months of Hoffman's sentencing, the Department of Justice launched a comprehensive investigation into the Brookhaven Police Department that resulted in a federal consent decree requiring extensive reforms. The department was mandated to implement new training programs on racial bias, establish an independent oversight board, and equip all officers with body cameras that could not be manually deactivated during traffic stops. Maya's experience became a catalyst for federal legislation. Working closely with congressional allies, she helped draft the Truth in Traffic Enforcement Act, which required police departments receiving federal funding to collect and publicly report detailed data on traffic stops, including the race of drivers, reasons for stops, and outcomes of searches. The legislation built on existing research showing that data transparency was one of the most effective tools for reducing racial disparities in traffic enforcement. Perhaps more importantly, Maya's case inspired other victims to come forward. The federal investigation ultimately identified 73 people who had been targeted by Hoffman and his associates, resulting in the dismissal of hundreds of criminal charges. and millions of dollars in civil settlements. Marcus Johnson, the software engineer whose case had paralleled Maya's experience, became a prominent advocate for criminal justice reform and eventually joined Maya's DEA task force on police accountability. Maya herself underwent a profound transformation. While she remained committed to her role at the DEA, her priorities shifted toward building bridges between law enforcement and communities of color. She established the Richardson Initiative, a program that brought together police officers, community leaders, and civil rights advocates to develop best practices for bias-free policing. "The goal isn't to attack law enforcement," Maya explained during a speech at the International Association of Chiefs of Police annual conference. "The goal is to strengthen law enforcement by ensuring that every officer upholds the highest standards of integrity and constitutional policing. Good cops should be the first to want bad cops held accountable." Her message resonated with reform-minded officers who had been quietly fighting corruption within their own departments. Officer Jennifer Blake, who had courageously testified against her partner, became one of Maya's closest collaborators and eventually joined the FBI's Civil Rights Division as a special agent focused on police misconduct investigations. The personal healing process was more complex. Maya continued therapy and found strength in connecting with other survivors of police misconduct. She began speaking regularly at community events, sharing her story not as a victim, but as someone who had transformed trauma into purpose. "The officer who planted evidence in my car thought he was dealing with just another black woman he could intimidate and frame," Maya told an audience at the National Urban League annual conference. "He had no idea that he was dealing with someone who had spent her entire career preparing to fight exactly this kind of injustice. But here's what I learned. I shouldn't have needed a federal badge to be treated with dignity and respect. Every person, regardless of their position or background, deserves constitutional policing." Maya's story also had international implications. Civil rights delegations from other countries studying American policing practices cited her case as an example of both the persistence of racial bias in law enforcement and the potential for accountability when victims have the resources and platform to fight back. The long-term impact of Maya's case became clear in the years following Hoffman's conviction. Police departments across the country began implementing the reforms pioneered in Brookhaven, often citing the Richardson case as a catalyst for change. Academy training programs incorporated her story as a case study in the importance of constitutional policing and the consequences of misconduct. By 2023, traffic stop disparities in jurisdictions that had implemented Richardson Initiative reforms showed measurable improvement, with some departments reducing racial disparities in stops and searches by over 40%. Maya's parents, James and Dr. Angela Richardson, lived to see their daughter honored with the John Lewis Civil Rights Award in 2022. "She took the lessons we taught her about excellence and dignity," her father said during the ceremony, "and used them to make the world a little more just for everyone." The woman who had started that October morning simply trying to get to a congressional meeting about police reform had become living proof that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is simply refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. Dr. Maya Richardson's story is both unique and universal. Unique in the position of power she held that allowed her to fight back effectively. Universal in the experience of racial profiling that millions of Americans face daily. Her journey, from victim to victor, illustrates fundamental truths about racism, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for justice in America. The most powerful lesson from Maya's experience is that justice is not automatic. It requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to speak truth to power, even when the consequences are uncertain. Officer Hoffman's conviction didn't happen because the system naturally protects victims of police misconduct. It happened because Maya refused to be silenced, because Officer Blake chose integrity over loyalty, and because a community of advocates refused to let another case of racial profiling disappear into bureaucratic silence. Maya's story also reminds us that individual acts of courage can create ripples of systemic change. The reforms implemented in Brookhaven, the federal legislation inspired by her case, and the countless officers who recommitted to constitutional policing after learning about her experience, all represent progress that began with one woman's refusal to accept injustice. But perhaps the most important message from Maya's journey is that the fight for racial justice requires all of us. Not everyone will face what Maya faced, but everyone can play a role in demanding accountability, supporting victims of discrimination, and working to create a society where a person's race doesn't determine how they're treated by those sworn to protect and serve. As Maya often says in her speeches, justice is not a destination, it's a practice. And like any practice, it requires daily commitment, constant vigilance, and the understanding that each generation must do its part to bend the arc of history toward justice. The question isn't whether racism exists in our institutions. The question is what each of us will do about it.